Tame this horse, and I'm yours." She laughed. Then a nameless cowboy tamed it with one, whispered. The dust of Bitter Creek held secrets like a miser hoards gold. In this sun-scorched corner of territorial Texas, where pride ran as deep as the aquifers and twice as dangerous a challenge was about to unfold, that would strip away every comfortable lie the town had built around itself. Cassandra Whitmore stood in the center of it all, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her defiance, whose father's wealth had become both fortress and prison. The stallion beside her, magnificent and untouchable, paced with the restless energy of something that had never known surrender. "Tame this horse," she had declared to the gathered crowd of would-be suitors, "and I'm yours." The words hung in the desert air like a thrown gauntlet, heavy with challenge and impossibility. What she didn't know was that among the eager cowboys and fortune hunters stood a man who understood that some things could never be tamed, only trusted. A man whose quiet presence would soon unravel everything she thought she knew about strength, about freedom, about the difference between conquest and connection. This is the story of how a whispered word changed 3 lives forever, and how sometimes the gentlest touch can move mountains that brute force cannot budge. What do you think it takes to truly reach someone who's built walls around their heart? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective on the power of understanding over domination. The arena dust swirled like prophecy in the late afternoon heat, each grain catching the amber light that slanted through the mesquite trees bordering the Whitmore ranch. Cassandra stood at its center, a vision carved from defiance and draped in calico that had cost more than most men earned in a season. Her father's prize stallion, Tempest, circled behind the corral fence like a caged storm, his midnight coat gleaming with the sheen of barely contained fury. "Gentlemen," she called out, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd with the clarity of a church bell, "before you stands the finest piece of horseflesh in 3 counties. Untamed. Untouched." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the eager faces. Untouchable. The crowd pressed closer. Cowboys, fresh from the trail, rubbed their hands on their chaps, calculating odds and glory. Town merchants adjusted their suspenders, dreaming of marrying into Whitmore wealth. Even the preacher had wandered over, though whether for the spectacle or to condemn it remained unclear. "The challenge is simple." Cass continued, her smile sharp as broken glass. "Any man who can mount this horse and ride him for 10 seconds wins my hand in marriage." A rumble of excitement rippled through the assembly. Behind her, Jeremiah Whitmore watched from the shade of his sprawling ranch house veranda, his face unreadable as granite. He'd indulged his daughter's willful nature for 22 years, but this performance served his purposes. Let them try and fail. Let Cass remain unmarried until he could arrange something more advantageous. Near the back of the crowd, almost invisible in his stillness, stood a figure that seemed carved from shadow and silence. While others shifted and whispered and postured, he remained motionless, his weathered hands resting on a fence post, his attention divided between the magnificent stallion and the woman whose laughter couldn't quite mask the loneliness in her eyes. "Who'll be first?" Cass challenged, and 3 men stepped forward simultaneously. Big Jim Hawthorne, foreman of the Double Bar Ranch, cracked his knuckles like splitting kindling. "Ma'am, I've broke horses from here to El Paso. That black devil won't know what hit him." Beside him, Tommy Briscoe, young cocky with more confidence than sense, grinned wide. "Miss Cassandra, I've been riding since before I could walk proper. Give me 5 minutes with that stallion." The third man, a stranger from back east with soft hands and harder eyes, simply nodded. "Cornelius Fairweather," he introduced himself with a slight bow. "I've studied European methods of equestrian management." Cass's smile turned predatory. "Wonderful. Jim, you're first." What followed was less horsemanship than controlled violence. Tempest exploded from the moment the gate opened his powerful hindquarters, launching Big Jim skyward before depositing him face first in the dust. The foreman rolled away from steel-shod hooves, spitting dirt and curses in equal measure. Tommy fared no better, though his youth bought him a fraction more time before Tempest's buck sent him flying into the fence rails with a crack that made the crowd wince. Cornelius lasted exactly 4 seconds before his European methods met Texas reality with bone-jarring finality. Through it all, the silent man watched. He saw what others missed, the way Tempest's rage masked something deeper, a wound that went beyond the flesh. The horse wasn't fighting men. He was fighting the world that had tried to break him the hands that had demanded submission without offering understanding. "Well," Cass announced as the third challenger limped away, "it seems my virtue remains intact for another day." The crowd began to disperse, muttering about the impossible task and the proud woman who'd set it. But as they turned to leave, a voice spoke from the shadows, quiet, measured, carrying the weight of distant thunder. "Ma'am!" All heads turned. The nameless man stepped forward, his movement fluid as water over stone. He was neither young nor old, neither handsome nor plain, but something in his presence made the gathered crowd unconsciously part before him. "You aim to try your luck with Tempest?" Cass asked, though something in his approach made her earlier mockery die on her lips. He touched the brim of his worn hat. "With your permission." There was no boasting in him, no swagger or showmanship. Just a quiet certainty that made Tempest stop his restless pacing and turn toward the sound of his voice. "What's your name, stranger?" Jeremiah called from the veranda. The man's eyes met the rancher's steadily. "Names are earned, sir. I haven't earned one here yet." The sun had begun its descent toward the horizon, painting the arena in shades of copper and shadow. Word of the challenge had spread like wildfire through Bitter Creek, drawing more spectators than the 4th of July celebration. Cowboys rode in from neighboring ranches, saloon girls gathered on the hotel balcony, and even children pressed against the fence rails, their wide eyes reflecting the drama unfolding in the dust. Cass found herself studying the nameless stranger as challenger after challenger failed to master Tempest. While others boasted and postured, he remained still as carved stone, his attention fixed not on her, but on the magnificent stallion that continued to defy every attempt at conquest. "Next," she called, her voice losing some of its earlier amusement as the afternoon wore on. Dutch Morrison, a horse trader from Abilene, approached with a coiled rope and supreme confidence. "Miss Whitmore, I've gentled mustangs that'd make this pretty boy look like a Sunday ride." The crowd pressed closer. Dutch's reputation preceded him. They said he could break any horse that drew breath. He entered the corral with the swagger of a man who'd never met his match, the rope singing through the air as he cast it toward Tempest's head. The stallion moved like liquid lightning, avoiding the loop with contemptuous ease. When Dutch tried to corner him, Tempest reared his hooves, slashing the air inches from the cowboy's face. The second attempt at roping resulted in Dutch diving for the fence as 1,000 pounds of furious horseflesh thundered past. "Hellfire and damnation!" Dutch spat as he rolled under the bottom rail. "That ain't no horse, that's a demon." From the crowd, nervous laughter erupted. But the nameless man didn't laugh. His weathered face remained impassive, though Cass caught a flicker of something pain cross his features as he watched Tempest's display of wounded fury. "Anyone else?" she challenged, though her voice carried less triumph than before. 3 more men tried their luck. Carlos Mendez, a vaquero whose grandfather had learned horsemanship from the Comanche, lasted 8 seconds before Tempest's spinning buck sent him sprawling. Preacher Williams surprised everyone by attempting to lay hands on the beast and drive out its demons, an endeavor that ended with his dignity scattered in the dust along with his Bible. The final challenger was young Billy Hawthorne, Big Jim's nephew, who approached the task with more heart than sense. The boy lasted 5 terrifying seconds before Tempest's fury launched him clear over the fence into his uncle's arms. As Billy was carried away, his leg bent at an unnatural angle, a silence fell over the arena. The entertainment had soured the spectacle, revealing something uglier beneath its surface. They were watching a creature's soul being torn apart for their amusement, and some small part of their collective conscience began to stir. "Well," Cass said, her voice brittle as autumn leaves, "it appears Tempest remains unconquered." But even as she spoke the words, her gaze drifted to the silent stranger who hadn't moved from his position by the fence. He was watching the stallion with an expression she couldn't decipher, not defeat or frustration like the others, but something deeper. Recognition, perhaps. Or understanding. "You still planning to try, Mr.?" called out Dutch, still nursing his bruised pride. "Or are you smart enough to know when you're whipped?" The stranger's attention shifted from horse to woman, and for a moment their eyes met across the dust-filled space. What passed between them in that instant defied description, a current of understanding that bypassed words entirely. "I reckon," he said quietly, "that depends on what we're really trying to accomplish here." Jeremiah Whitmore leaned forward in his chair, his businessman's instincts prickling. There was something about this drifter that didn't sit right, too calm, too knowing, too dangerous in his very stillness. "What do you mean by that?" Jeremiah demanded. The stranger touched his hat brim respectfully. "Just that some things can't be taken, sir. They can only be given." His words fell into the gathering twilight like stones into still water, creating ripples that would reach far beyond this single evening. In the corral, Tempest had stopped his restless pacing and stood facing the fence where the man waited, as if sensing that something fundamental was about to change. Cass felt her heart begin to beat faster, though she couldn't have said why. The afternoon had begun as a game, a clever way to avoid unwanted suitors while maintaining the appearance of availability, but standing in the amber light, with this quiet stranger's words echoing in her ears, she realized that some games had stakes higher than she'd ever imagined. "Well," she heard herself ask, her voice softer than before, "are you going to try?" The nameless man stepped toward the gate, and every person in that arena held their breath. The quality of silence that fell over the arena was different now, not the expectant hush of spectators awaiting spectacle, but something deeper, more profound. As the nameless stranger approached the corral gate, even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath. Unlike the others who had strutted and boasted their way to failure, he moved with the fluid grace of someone who understood that true power whispered rather than shouted. No rope coiled in his hands, no spurs gleamed on his boots. He carried nothing but the weight of his own quiet presence. "No rope," Dutch Morrison called out, confusion evident in his voice. "No saddle. How you planning to ride that devil?" The stranger paused at the gate, his hand resting on the weathered wood. "Some things can't be ridden," he said, his voice carrying in the stillness. "They can only be joined." Cass felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of defenses she hadn't realized she'd built. The man's words seemed directed not at the crowd, but at something deeper, something that resonated in a place she'd thought was safely buried. He entered the corral without fanfare, closing the gate behind him with a soft click that somehow rang louder than all the earlier shouting. Tempest stood at the far end, magnificent and terrible in his isolation, his dark coat rippling with the tension of coiled lightning. For a long moment, man and horse simply regarded each other across the dust. Then the stranger began to speak, but not to the crowd. His words were meant for Tempest alone, so soft that most couldn't hear them over the sound of their own breathing. "I know what it's like," he murmured, taking a single step forward. "To be pushed and pulled and broken until you don't know who you are anymore. To have everyone want to own you, but no one want to understand you." Tempest's ears flicked forward, the first sign of anything other than rage they'd shown all day. The stranger took another step, his movements slow and deliberate. I know what it's like to carry pain so deep you can't remember what it felt like before it lived in your bones. To be called wild when you're really just tired of being hurt? Something impossible was happening. Tempest hadn't moved away. The stallion stood transfixed, his powerful frame trembling not with fury, but with something else entirely, recognition, perhaps, or the first stirring of trust. In the crowd, Cass found herself leaning forward, straining to catch the stranger's words. She felt exposed, as if he were speaking not just to the horse, but directly to every hidden corner of her heart. They see strength, and they want to break it. The man continued now, close enough to touch the stallion's neck. They see beauty, and they want to own it. They see freedom, and they want to cage it. But that's not what you need, is it, friend? Tempest took a step toward him, actually moved closer to a human being, for the first time since he'd been brought to the ranch. The crowd's collective gasp was audible, but the stranger didn't acknowledge it. His entire world had narrowed to the space between himself and the magnificent creature before him. "What you need," he whispered, extending his hand palm up, "is someone who sees the pain behind the power. Someone who understands that real strength isn't about never falling down, it's about choosing to trust again after you've been broken." The moment Tempest's muzzle touched the stranger's palm was electric. A shock of connection passed between them, visible to everyone watching, yet intimate as a prayer. The stallion's great dark eyes, which had held nothing but fury and fear, suddenly brimmed with something else entirely. The stranger's other hand rose slowly, coming to rest on Tempest's neck. "That's it," he breathed. "You don't have to fight anymore. Not with me." From her place at the arena's edge, Cass felt tears she hadn't permission herself to shed begin to blur her vision. The scene before her was more than horsemanship. It was a revelation of what became possible when someone approached another being's pain with genuine understanding rather than a desire to conquer. "What's he doing?" someone whispered. "Magic," another voice breathed. But it wasn't magic. It was something rarer and more precious, the patient, careful work of healing. As the stranger continued to speak in tones too low for most to hear, Tempest's entire bearing began to change. The rigid tension in his frame softened. The wild desperation in his eyes gentled to something approaching peace. When the man finally placed his hands on Tempest's back, there was no explosion of fury, no bucking or rearing. The stallion stood steady as a mountain, trembling slightly but holding firm, as if recognizing that this touch carried no demand for submission, only an offer of partnership. The stranger swung onto Tempest's back with fluid grace, and the arena held its collective breath. But instead of the violent eruption they'd witnessed all afternoon, horse and rider stood together in perfect stillness, two wounded souls finding solace in shared understanding. It was Cass who broke the silence, her voice soft with wonder. "How?" The stranger's eyes met hers across the dust, and in them she saw depths she hadn't expected, pain transformed into compassion, strength tempered by gentleness, and something else that made her heart race with possibilities she'd never dared imagine. "Sometimes," he said, his words carrying to every corner of the arena, "the best way to win someone's heart is to let them know they're not alone with their pain." The transformation in the arena was so complete, so profound, that for several heartbeats nobody moved. Tempest stood calm as a lake at dawn, the stranger on his back as natural as sunrise itself. The violent, untouchable stallion had become something else entirely, not broken, but willing, not conquered, but connected. Then the spell shattered. "Impossible," Jeremiah Whitmore's voice cut through the twilight like a blade. He stood on his veranda, his knuckles white where they gripped the railing. "It's some kind of trick. Witchcraft." The crowd stirred uneasily. The miracle they'd witnessed was too unsettling, too far outside their understanding of how the world worked. Whispers began to circulate, suspicious, fearful murmurs that spread like wildfire through the gathered spectators. "Did you see how that horse just gave in? Ain't natural a wild stallion actin' like that. What kind of man has that kind of power over a beast?" Cass felt the mood shifting around her like quicksand, but her eyes remained fixed on the man who sat so easily on Tempest's back. In the growing darkness with shadows pooling around them, he looked like something from a legend, mysterious, powerful, dangerous, in ways that had nothing to do with violence. "The challenge stands," she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "He's won fair and square." "Has he?" Jeremiah descended from the veranda, his face a mask of barely controlled anger. "We don't know anything about this person, where he comes from, what his intentions are." His gaze swept the crowd, rallying them to his cause. "For all we know, he's some kind of horse thief using dark arts to steal what doesn't belong to him." The stranger swung down from Tempest's back with fluid grace, his hand never leaving the stallion's neck. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but underneath it, Cass detected something else. A weariness that spoke of too many accusations, too many people who preferred their fears to the truth. "I've stolen nothing, sir," he said quietly. "Only offered friendship to a creature that's known too little of it." "Friendship?" Jeremiah's laugh was harsh. "You've bewitched a valuable animal with whatever dark knowledge you carry. I won't have such influences near my daughter." The crowd pressed closer, their earlier amazement curdling into suspicion. Cass saw their faces in the lamplight, neighbors she'd known since childhood, now looking at the stranger as if he were some kind of demon. Fear was contagious, she realized, spreading faster than understanding ever could. "Pa," she said, stepping forward. "He won the challenge fairly." "Did he?" Jeremiah's eyes glittered with something ugly. "Tommy ride to town, fetch Sheriff Morrison. I want to know if there are any wanted posters on file for mysterious strangers with unusual abilities." The young cowboy hesitated, glancing between his employer and the quiet man who'd accomplished the impossible. "Mr. Whitmore, I don't think. Now, Tommy." As the rider galloped toward town, the stranger's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on Tempest's neck. The stallion sensed the tension, his ears flicking nervously as the crowd's mood darkened around them. "Ma'am," the stranger said, touching his hat brim to Cass, "perhaps it would be best if I—" "No." The word burst from her lips with surprising force. "You won. The bargain stands." She moved to stand beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his travel-worn coat, close enough to catch the scent of sage and leather that clung to him. For the first time in her life, she was choosing something her father hadn't approved first, and the sensation was both terrifying and exhilarating. "Cassandra," Jeremiah's voice carried a warning that made lesser men step back. "Return to the house. Now." "I'm not a child anymore, Pa." She lifted her chin, meeting his glare with defiance that surprised them both. "I made a public challenge, and this man met it. I won't go back on my word because you're afraid of what you don't understand." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Father and daughter faced each other across the arena, 22 years of gentle rebellion finally erupting into open conflict. The crowd watched with the hungry fascination of people witnessing the collapse of an established order. It was the stranger who broke the standoff, his voice soft, but carrying clearly in the charged air. "There's something you should know," he said, addressing the crowd but looking at Cass, "about why I understand what it means to be called dangerous for being different." Before anyone could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the desert. Multiple riders moving fast. Sheriff Morrison returning with reinforcements or something worse. Tempest snorted, sensing the approaching threat. The stranger's hand moved to comfort the stallion, but his eyes remained fixed on Cass's face as if memorizing it against the possibility that this might be their last moment together. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "know that what happened here tonight was real. What passed between all of us was real." The hoofbeats grew louder, and with them came the weight of a world that preferred its mysteries safely buried, its wildness properly caged, and its truths conveniently hidden from the light. The riders materialized from the darkness like harbingers of judgment, Sheriff Morris and Deputy Barnes, and behind them 2 figures that made the crowd collectively hold its breath. A federal marshal, his badge gleaming in the lamplight, and beside him a man whose very presence seemed to drain warmth from the air. Colonel Marcus Thorne, Indian fighter, hero to some, butcher to others. The stranger's face went stone still as he recognized the approaching figures, but his hand remained steady on Tempest's neck. The stallion sensed the shift in his rider's tension and shifted restlessly, dark eyes rolling toward the newcomers. "Gabriel Stone," the marshal called out as his horse clattered to a stop at the arena's edge. "Also known as Captain Stone, formerly of the 7th Cavalry Regiment. You're under arrest for desertion and conduct unbecoming an officer." A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Gabriel. Finally, a name for the mystery. Cass felt the word hit her like a physical blow. She turned to study his profile in the flickering torchlight, seeing now what she'd missed before the military bearing beneath the drifter's clothes, the quiet authority that spoke of command, the weight of decisions that had cost him everything. "There must be some mistake," she heard herself say, but Gabriel shook his head slowly. "No mistake, ma'am." His voice was quiet, resigned. "Though the charges ain't quite accurate." Colonel Thorne urged his horse forward, his face a mask of righteous satisfaction. Captain Stone was court-martialed for refusing a direct order during the Washita River operation. He abandoned his post rather than participate in a necessary military action against hostile Indians. "Hostile Indians?" Gabriel's laugh was bitter as alkali water. "Is that what you're calling women and children now, Marcus?" The arena crackled with tension. Most of the crowd didn't understand the military specifics, but they recognized the weight of old anger, old betrayals being dragged into the light. "You always were soft stone," Thorne continued. "Too weak to do what civilization required. That's why you couldn't stomach the realities of frontier justice." Gabriel's composure finally cracked. In one fluid motion, he swung onto Tempest's back, the stallion responding to his emotion with a sidestep that scattered the nearest spectators. "Frontier justice," Gabriel's voice carried across the arena with the force of suppressed fury. "You want to tell these good people about your frontier justice, Marcus. About the village you ordered, burned. About the children who ran into the river to escape your guns. That's enough." Thorne's hand moved to his sidearm. "You're a deserter and a traitor, and you'll hang for both." But Cass stepped forward, placing herself between Gabriel and the soldiers. "Wait." Her voice cut through the tension like a blade. "You said this happened at Washita River." The marshal nodded curtly. "November of '68. Stone here refused to follow orders and abandoned his position." "My God!" The words escaped Cass in a whisper. She'd heard stories of Washita everyone on the frontier had. Cheyenne Chief Black Kettle's village flying the American flag, and a white flag of peace destroyed in a dawn attack that left over 100 dead, mostly women and children. She turned to look at Gabriel, seeing him now not as a deserter, but as a man who'd chosen his conscience over his career, his humanity over his orders. "You refused to participate in a massacre," she said. It wasn't a question. Gabriel's eyes met hers, and in them she saw the weight of that choice, the cost of standing up for what was right when everyone around you chose what was expedient. "I took an oath to protect the innocent," he said simply, "even if my superiors forgot what that meant." The words hung in the desert air like a challenge to every person present. How many of them would have made the same choice? How many would have sacrificed everything for the sake of strangers they'd never meet? Jeremiah Whitmore's voice cut through the moral complexity like a businessman cutting through sentiment. Regardless of the circumstances, he's a wanted man. I won't have my daughter associated with a fugitive. Your daughter, Gabriel said, his attention shifting from the soldiers to the rancher, made her own choice tonight. Seems to me she's capable of making her own decisions. The challenge was unmistakable. Around the arena, the crowd sensed the convergence of forces: military justice, paternal authority, and a woman's right to choose her own path. Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. Now, folks, let's not make this any more complicated than it needs to be. Mr. Stone, if you'll just come quietly. Gabriel looked at Cass one last time, his expression holding 1,000 unspoken words. Then he gathered Tempest's mane in his hands and prepared to run. But before he could move, Cass grabbed the stallion's bridle. "No," she said, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "I won't let you face this alone." The words transformed everything. What had begun as a simple challenge had become something far more significant, a test of courage, conscience, and the price of standing up for what was right. In the distance, thunder rumbled across the desert sky as if the heavens themselves were preparing to weigh in on the judgment about to unfold. The thunder grew closer, and with it came the desert wind that carried the scent of distant rain and the promise of change. Lightning flickered on the horizon, illuminating the faces gathered in the arena, each one a study in moral complexity. Gabriel looked down at Cass, her hand still gripping Tempest's bridle, her chin raised in defiance of everything her upbringing had taught her about a woman's place. "You don't understand what you're asking," he said quietly. "These men won't just walk away. There's too much at stake." "Then tell them the truth," she replied, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "All of it." Gabriel's gaze swept across the assembled crowd, neighbors, cowboys, townspeople who'd come for entertainment, and found themselves witnesses to something far more profound. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of years held silent. "The children from Washita," he began, his voice cutting through the desert wind. "The ones who survived the massacre, where do you think they ended up?" Uncomfortable murmurs rippled through the crowd. Everyone knew about the Indian children who worked the ranches, the ones taken in as wards after their families were killed. They'd simply never thought to ask how they'd become orphans. "Some of them are here," Gabriel continued, his gaze finding faces in the crowd that suddenly couldn't meet his eyes. "Working your ranches, cleaning your houses, invisible as shadows, because it's easier than remembering how they lost their families." Jeremiah Whitmore's face had gone pale. "That's enough." "Is it?" Cass turned to face her father, understanding dawning in her eyes. "The children who work our kitchen, who tend our horses, how many of them are from Washita Pa?" The silence that followed was deafening. Lightning cracked overhead, and in its harsh illumination, the moral landscape of Bitter Creek was suddenly starkly visible. Colonel Thorne, sensing the shift in the crowd's mood, pressed his advantage. "Stone is a criminal and a traitor. Whatever sob story he's spinning doesn't change that fact." But an unexpected voice rose from the crowd, soft, accented, belonging to a young woman who cleaned the Whitmore house. "My name was Little Bird," she said, stepping forward into the light. "Before the soldiers came, before my village burned." More voices began to speak. Stories that had been buried for years suddenly found the courage to emerge, each one a nail in the coffin of comfortable lies. The marshal looked increasingly uncomfortable. "This is ancient history." "I have orders." "Your orders," Gabriel interrupted, his voice calm but carrying a steel edge, "were issued by men who want their crimes to stay buried. How convenient that the one witness to their atrocities should disappear into a prison cell. He leaned forward, addressing the crowd directly. You want to know why I really ran? It wasn't cowardice, it was evidence. Letters, photographs, testimony that would hang a dozen officers if it ever saw the light of day. Thunder crashed overhead, and the first fat raindrops began to fall, each one striking the dust like a judgment. Cass felt the pieces clicking into place, Gabriel's quiet authority, his understanding of pain, his ability to see the wounded soul beneath Tempest's fury. He wasn't just a deserter. He was a man who'd chosen truth over convenience, justice, over orders, conscience, over career. The evidence, she said, understanding, flooding through her. You still have it. Gabriel's slight nod was answer enough. In that moment, every person in the arena understood that they were witnessing more than a fugitive's capture. They were seeing the potential unraveling of secrets that reached all the way to Washington. Colonel Thorne's hand moved to his gun, but Sheriff Morrison stepped between them. Now hold on, Marcus. This is getting bigger than one deserter. The rain began in earnest, now washing the dust from the air and revealing everything in sharp, clean detail. Cass made her choice. I'm going with him, she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the storm. As his wife, as his partner, as his witness. Jeremiah exploded. Cassandra, I forbid it. You can't forbid a married woman anything, Pa. She turned to Gabriel, her eyes bright with possibility and determination. That is if you'll have me. Gabriel's answer was to extend his hand to her. It won't be easy. We'll be fugitives until the truth comes out. Then we'd better make sure it does. She grasped his hand and swung up behind him on Tempest's back, the stallion steady beneath their combined weight. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the three of them, woman, man, and horse, turned toward the storm-lashed horizon. Lightning illuminated their silhouettes, transforming them into something mythic, legendary. Stop them, Thorne shouted, but his voice was lost in the thunder. Sheriff Morrison made no move to intervene. Neither did the marshal. They were local law enforcement, not military, and the weight of revelations had shifted the moral ground beneath their feet. As Gabriel guided Tempest toward the open desert, Cass called back over the wind. The truth has a way of surfacing, Colonel, even when you try to bury it. They rode into the storm, three figures moving toward a future that promised no guarantees except the chance to live with honor intact. Behind them, Bitter Creek would never be the same. The comfortable lies had been shattered, and in their place, difficult truths would have to grow. The last thing the crowd heard was the sound of hoofbeats fading into thunder, carrying with them the echo of a choice that would reshape everything they thought they knew about courage, about justice, and about the price of standing up for what was right. Years later, when the full story of Washita finally emerged, and certain officers faced the consequences of their actions, people would remember the night a nameless stranger tamed an untamable horse with nothing but understanding, and a woman chose love over security, truth over comfort. But that night all they could do was stand in the rain and watch three souls ride toward freedom, their courage illuminated by lightning, and their path lit by the fierce, uncompromising light of truth. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe for more tales of courage, redemption, and the power of choosing what's right over what's easy. What other untold stories of the frontier would you like to see brought to light? Share your thoughts below.